All right, it's time to talk some NBA headlines. And for that, I'm joined by Jeff Zillgitt of USA Today. Hey, Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Well, listen, there's a lot to cover, so let's jump right into it. Let's start with the big storyline, the kind of macro storyline that everybody's talking about. LeBron James in pursuit of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's record. He's getting closer. It's eventually going to be the all-time scoring record. How do you put this into context when you think about the era that the Wilt Chamberlains of the world, the Kareems of the world played in compared to today's high-scoring affair that we've seen?
Well, just right off the bat, when you mentioned those two players, Wilt and Kareem, they were big men who dominated that era. In fact, if you look at some of the other previous scoring leaders, whether it's a Bob Pettit or a Dolph Schayes, and you can sort of see the evolution of the game move. Now, we know Karl Malone was up there as well, but then you start seeing the scorers like Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and now LeBron. And if you just look at their overall games, they just weren't one thing. They just weren't inside players. They just weren't outside players. They could do a lot of things when it came to scoring. And LeBron is a perfect illustration of that. And you sort of see that through the trajectory of his career when, we all know he attacks the basket, scores points in the paint. Early in his career, he wasn't that long-range threat. And so he took a lot more mid-range shots. But we've seen the way the game has evolved where three-pointers have taken on such great importance in today's NBA. And you see LeBron take advantage of that. And so you see the different ways that he's been able to score. And when you put it all together, just the amount of games he's been able to play year in, year out. I know he's had some injuries lately, but there's the consistency of being on the court. He usually shoots between 47 and 52%, and he's always right around that 28 points per game. And he's done that for pretty much an entire 20-year career.
Are the Lakers failing him right now in terms of these sort of golden years where he is climbing into cementing himself into the pantheon of all-time greats? I mean, they're flailing towards the bottom of the Western Conference. What is going on in LA? And is this, I don't want to say a waste, but, something that we're going to look back on and say, man, he probably could have done more?
You make a great point because the fact is you don't get a player at 38 years old who can score and perform at this level. No player's done this. Karl Malone played a long time. Kareem played a long time. But they didn't put up these kinds of – LeBron's averaging 30 points a game right now. That's, I think, as it is right now, a top 3 scoring per season for LeBron. And so what you're pointing out is you need to take advantage of this somehow. And the Lakers have been super protective of the 2027 and 2029 first-round picks that they have. They're trying to balance that fine line between winning now and then protecting their future. And it's a real difficult line to walk. LeBron wants to win now. He's just not playing out a string of games. So I think the Rui Hachimura trade was a start. I'm not sure that the Lakers are finished. We'll see what happens before that trade deadline coming up here later in February. But if you're LeBron, you certainly want to have the front office make another move. If you look at that Western Conference standings, you say they're at the bottom, and they are. But they're also not that far from putting together a 7-3, 8-2, 9-1 winning streak and being among the top 6 teams in the Western Conference. That's how closely bunched they are. I think LeBron sees that window to get in there.
I'm sure everybody asks you, Jeff, to put everything in context when you talk about the greatest to have ever done it, the greatest scorers of all time. Everybody talks endlessly about Michael Jordan versus LeBron. With the differences and the nuances in the game, like you mentioned, the potential for players to score a lot more points in today's game, is there a way to actually quantify where LeBron sits among the greatest of all time? Do you have a personal viewpoint on it? Is he the greatest of all time in your opinion?
He is. If you're just asking the question, and when we ranked our top 75 players all time last year for the NBA 75th anniversary, I did list LeBron as my number 1 player all time. I certainly get the point that it's very difficult to compare eras. Even going back to an era in which Elgin Baylor played is so drastically different than Julius Erving and then Magic. And then you obviously have Kareem in there scoring, but then Jordan, Kobe. All these eras were different, and there were rule changes along the way as well. And a lot of these rules changes over the years have favored the offensive player. hand checking was eliminated. Defensive 3 seconds played a greater impact. And so offensive players certainly benefited. It is very difficult. And then, look, do I believe Jordan could have been a great three-point shooter? I do. That just wasn't part of the game right then. We even talk about Larry Bird and what a great three-point shooter he was. Steph Curry takes more three-pointers in the first quarter than Larry Bird took in a game sometimes. And so there's just a difference in the way the game is played. So that does make it difficult. But we're talking about LeBron's scoring, but he's also going to finish at the very least, and he just moved into 4th place on the all-time assist list. Yeah. And if he continues to play a couple more years, he's going to move up into the top 3 if he passes Chris Paul, and which seems realistic the way LeBron is going. And so now you're talking about a player who's the top scorer, top 3 in assists. He collects a ton of rebounds. I don't know where he'll finish overall in his career. And you look at his overall game and what he's able to do. And I know he doesn't have the most championships, but just the way he plays the game, that separates him just a little bit from all the other players we're talking about.
Yeah. Is there a way to quantify the meaning of him also reaching this all-time scoring record in nearly 150 or so, 125 games fewer than it took, Kareem to do it?
I think that speaks a lot to the analytics of the game and how efficiency has played a big role in when you look at LeBron's career. That efficiency really took off in Miami under Eric Spoelstra, the Heat coach. And you're going to take LeBron, I think, in one of his best years in Miami, took 17 shots per game, made 10 of them per game. He's shooting 40% from three-pointers, and he's getting to the foul line, maybe 8 times a game during that era. And so you start to see a greater importance placed on how you're getting your points, where you're getting your points. And again, I'm going to go back to that three-point line. I think I was having fun looking at it. Maybe Kareem took a couple three-pointers. Now, obviously, they weren't shooting threes that way, and big men at that size don't shoot a ton of them, although we see a guy like Kristaps Porzingis do it today. But that three-point line has certainly maximized your ability to get points.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some numbers here right now, Jeff, because you mentioned the three-point line and the way that the game has changed. And also my producer sending me some information that individual scoring is up this season alone. So it's a trend that we've been seeing, but also particularly this season, there have been 19 50-point games this season, 3rd most before the All-Star break. So the numbers kind of allow us to think about this historic number of performances that we've seen from these shooters that are just throwing the ball up every chance they get. What do you think has been the genesis of that this particular season?
I think there's a handful of things that play a factor in that. I think the pace of the game. I know way back in the early days of the NBA, it was a hectic pace, but think of, and I know there's the Showtime Lakers, we think of their fast breaks with Magic, throwing the ball to, whether it was Kareem on the break or James Worthy. The pace slowed down a little bit. You think of those Pat Riley Knicks teams and the Pat Riley Heat teams when we were getting finals games in the 80s. Like, I think that right there shows how much we've changed the style of the game. I also think we're in an era of incredibly gifted individual players. When you talk about those 50-point-a-game scorers, you have a Jason Tatum, you have a Luka Doncic, you have Damian Lillard, the big guy, Nikola Jokic from Denver. Like the amount of gifted scorers in this league is amazing. And when you talk about the ability to spread the court the way they do, think of, again, I'm going to go back to that three-point line. When you have players like Steph shooting 35-foot three-pointers, that just makes the defense come out a little further. You have more avenues to drive to the basket and get a little easier opportunities. The court isn't as clogged. And so I think you start to add up all those things, and that's why we're seeing these high individual scoring performances this year. And you make a great point. I mean, look, it's been a lot of fun to watch. It doesn't seem like if there's not a 40-point score on a given night, like we're taking notice of that rather than taking notice that there was a 40-point score.
I know. It's so funny. I mean, just as an aside, I think it was Luka Doncic or something had a ridiculous performance like a couple weeks ago. And I was just kind of ho-hum doing the highlights of whatever, I was working on at the time. And somebody was like, you have to give that a little bit more energy. I'm like, I think I'm just used to the fact that we're seeing 50-point scores over and over and over again this season, that it's kind of it's lost a little bit of its luster, but it's still so remarkable. All that aside, not to be Debbie Downer, but the flip side of that, I think, is that when you have these incredible individual efforts, it also means that we're seeing game management, load management. Some of these guys are taking nights off. Maybe you pay for tickets, to a Lakers game and you don't see LeBron on a given night, or you don't see Kevin Durant with the Nets. I mean, is this a real issue that the NBA needs to deal with in terms of, are there too many games in the regular season? How do they address this issue of load management, game management, if in fact you think it's a problem?
It's a very complicated topic, and there are lots of avenues to go down. If look at Karl Malone, and you talk about load management. That guy played 80 to 82 games every season for a majority of his career, and he played in an era where, one, there wasn't the same amount of personal attention to recovery as there is today. The amount of private jets that players are taking has increased. So they think there's so much more benefit the way players are treated today. And yet there's also advances in sports science that weren't available 30, 40 years ago that show maybe a player shouldn't be playing 82 games a year. Let me answer your question directly. The NBA does think it's worth addressing because it's going to be, and it is a topic of collective bargaining talks between the league and the players union. And they're looking at ways to somehow incentivize the idea of players playing more games. And I don't know what the incentive will be. I don't know if it would be a financial incentive for the player, somehow for a group of players, but they definitely want those players on the court. And then when you talk about, there's going to be a group of people who really believe 72 games is sort of that sweet spot. Well, you also recognize that then there's going to be some revenue decreases. The amount of money from a TV deal, even the regional sports networks, they're not broadcasting the same amount of games. They're not bringing in the same amount of revenue. So are players going to be willing to maybe take a little bit less of that basketball-related income that is generated in order to play fewer games? And so that's why I really think it's a complicated topic. There's certainly a group of people out there who think fewer games would make for better competition, and yet 82 games has been the standard for going on 60 years of professional basketball. And so I think the idea is to stick with 82. The league has made great strides in eliminating back-to-backs, those 4 games in 5 day scenarios, and we'll see if they can find some solution to that idea of fans going to a game and seeing a player that they paid to come see be available to be in that game.
You set the table really well on such a complicated issue. Those regional sport networks obviously need the money. And, we're living in this time now of what people describe as quote unquote player empowerment, where players have more autonomy over their bodies. They're going to dictate what they want to do, what they don't feel is best. There's lots of opinions coming in on, their personal health. And like you say, social platforms, travel being different. I mean, it's a different world now than it was. I wonder what the answer is. I can't imagine. Can you imagine a scenario where you're actually going to get a longer season in a collective bargaining agreement? I can't see it being shorter just because I think money talks at the end of the day. But, what's your feel for where it's ultimately going to end up? And are we going to get to this place, Jeff, where maybe fans just prepare themselves for, if it's a back-to-back, or, there's certain days where you're just not going to see a star on the court?
I think there's going to be a little bit more attention paid to when Eastern Conference teams play Western Conference teams, and they're only in that opposite arena once a year. And to try to eliminate load management for Steph Curry when he goes to play Orlando. That's that one chance that Orlando fans are going to get to see Steph play that year. So if he's not injured, there's no load management for that game. Somehow find a way to make it work. And so don't have a back-to-back where the Warriors are playing in Miami on a Wednesday, Orlando on a Thursday, and maybe in other times that's a perfect spot for load management. Don't have them play it back-to-back there. I think the schedule maker, and this is a very difficult job, and they pour over this at the NBA office. I can't see the season starting any earlier. Think about, and I don't have the exact date, but I'm thinking 6-7 seasons ago, they made this switch where NBA games, the season opener used to be in late October. Now it's mid-October. And so they've already extended the season a little bit. You can't go too much further at the end of the season because you start to get into playoff season. They definitely take into consideration TV, making sure that now there's not too many playoff games being played every other day, especially those first 2 rounds. And so I think they're really going to look at the schedule. And then if indeed they can find ways to incentivize players to be available for those games where they're only going to be in an arena once a year, then maybe they can make some headway on that issue without too many dramatic changes.
It seems like an impossible job to be a schedule maker at the NBA and to consider everything that the TV people want, everything that the athletes want, everything that fans want. And I'm not sure there's a solution that is tailored to everybody, to your point, which is why it's so complicated. Because you brought up Steph, talk to me a little bit about what the Warriors have been going through. Obviously not the start that they would have wanted. What do you think is plaguing them?
I think it's a difference in the roster. Think about losing Gary Payton II, Otto Porter Jr. Those were 2 key players on a championship team. And then I don't know how you quantify this, but Draymond Green throwing a punch at Jordan Poole before the season starts, whether there's still a lingering impact, whether it's large, small, again, very difficult to quantify. But I even think we heard Draymond Green say in a podcast that it sort of altered the way he has led this team this year. Maybe he's not as vocal. The Warriors need him to be vocal, want him to be vocal. And then we look, just maybe a couple weeks ago, I'm in Washington, D.C., the Warriors come through town. They're right around 9 or 10 in the standings. They win a few games, and now they move up to 6th place and not far from being in 4th place. And let me say this much. I don't think there's a team in the Western Conference that wants to see a Warriors team that is hot and on a roll and maybe moved up to the 4th seed by the time the playoffs come. And they've also struggled a little bit with working guys like Jonathan Kuminga and Moses Moody and those younger guys. And I talk about that difficult balance that the Lakers are facing. The Warriors are doing it in real time with trying to work in younger players, trying to win with veterans. And, in the between, they don't always meet. And so that's what they're struggling with. If you believe, though, that a guy like Draymond, Steph, Clay, that they're somehow going to figure it out, giving all their institutional knowledge of what it takes, they're probably going to be in okay position. They might not be the 1st seed, 2nd seed, or even the 3rd seed, but they're going to be a dangerous team if they're in the playoffs.
On the Eastern Conference side of things, you have seemingly, correct me if I'm wrong, more teams with quality depth. Things are a little bit more competitive. Kevin Durant is still dealing with this MCL injury that sidelined him. First of all, what's the latest that you're hearing about Kevin Durant and his recovery and potential availability for the second half of the season? And how do you see the East shaking out down the stretch with so many teams who we've already seen, have proven to be contenders?
So in relation to Kevin Durant, he is scheduled to be reevaluated here any day to check out that knee. And then that should start his progression. There have been reports out there that he wants to play in the All-Star game. So now you're talking, that's a February 20th game. That means he would probably need to play some games for the Nets before then. So we're looking at his return probably within the next couple weeks before that All-Star game. And then the depth of the East, both roster-wise and then just in the standings, I've been impressed with all season long. You see a lot of teams. Think about a team like the Miami Heat that made the conference finals last year, and they're not among the top 4 teams in the East right now. I really like I'm really looking forward, I guess, to these playoff matchups when we start seeing either a Milwaukee versus Philadelphia, Philadelphia versus Brooklyn, Boston, Milwaukee, whatever combination of teams you want to throw in there. Any of those 4 teams I just mentioned really have a shot to win the East. And maybe I give teams like Boston and Milwaukee just a little bit of the edge there because they've done it before. Milwaukee has that championship from a couple years ago. They know what it takes. Boston, think about losing your head coach at the beginning of the year, going to an interim coach with no head coaching experience in the NBA, and look what they're doing. Atop the East in the standings, and Joe Mazzulla is going to be the all-star coach, and they are just doing a fantastic job with Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, and that group of guys. Even though that's a new head coach for them, they certainly know what it takes to get there. And think about all the playoff experience between Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum at their young ages, mid-20s. You throw in Al Horford's experience, and you talk about a guy like Malcolm Brogdon and Marcus Smart. They have a really complete team, and I know other teams do as well. But they've been able to do it start to finish this year, or start to this midseason point, without a lot of ups and downs. And where we've seen ups and downs with some other teams, whether it's injury related or they're going through a little rut. And I know Philadelphia went healthy. Joel Embiid, James Harden, they think they have a quality team as well. So that's one of the most compelling storylines for the rest of the season.
This Celtics team, to your point, has been intact for the last couple of seasons for the most part. They've weathered an incredible amount of adversity, but Tatum and Brown and Marcus Smart, Robert Williams, Al Horford, these guys have been together. And is this the year that they finally are going to be able to get over the hump and have a legitimate chance at winning an NBA title together? Because the talent is there, but it just seems like they have had something that has made them come up just short over the last couple of years.
Well, when you think about, and this extends to LeBron James's run in the East when he was with Miami and then Cleveland 2.0, he was just impossible to beat. Even if they couldn't win a championship with all those teams every year, they went to 8 straight finals. And so then after that, Tatum and Brown were able to gain that experience. No LeBron in the way, or no LeBron-like player in the way, although Giannis is certainly considered one of maybe the top 2-3 players in the world right now. But Jason Tatum isn't far behind. When you're talking about MVP candidates, what he's able to do. Jaylen Brown is going to be an all-star as well, along with Tatum. And so you have 2 all-stars on the team. I very much think that this is the year that they should be able to do it. We'll see who comes out of the Western Conference. But either way, they're putting themselves in the best position that they've been in a long time to at least get back to the NBA Finals and have a shot. Don't forget, they were up 2-1 in that series against the Warriors last year. And then the Warriors, with all that experience, figured it out bit by bit how to stop Boston on both ends. But look, this is a really great chance, as you mentioned, for Boston to win a title. And I guess we go back to the last one was 2008 with Doc Rivers leading that Kevin Garnett, Ray Allen, Paul Pierce team.
Oh man, that was so fun to be a part of. And so you think that it's more situational and less a reflection of something that core group in Boston is doing differently. It's just breaking for them in a different way than it has the last couple of seasons.
I do. I think they're really, really close. I don't think it's like a problem. Look, are there issues that they need to address? Are there times where last year the Celtics were frustrated with turnovers by Jaylen Brown or Tatum in situations and maybe, faltering a little bit offensively? Of course, that's going to happen. But just to get to that spot in the finals and go through the teams that they had to go through, winning the Game 7 on the road in Miami to get to the finals, those things are really, really important. And, again, I go back to age. Brown and Tatum are just still so young when it comes to, getting to the finals. We think about, even when Jordan won his first finals and when LeBron won his first finals, it took them some time. And, it sort of reminds me of some old school sort of Detroit Pistons with the Isaiah Thomas. They could not get past the Celtics for a long, long time. They finally beat the Celtics. And then when they get to the finals, they lose to the Lakers. And then they had to come back again. I think there's a learning and growing experience, and that Boston Celtics current version might replicate some of that more 80s basketball. Even Jordan lost to the Pistons, for a few seasons before he finally figured it out and then could get to the finals and win.
Just the last thing for her, because I know you got to jump, just early kind of thoughts here around the trade deadline. Any teams that are title contenders that you think might stand pat? Anybody that you expect to make a really big move? What are you hearing?
Well, I don't know if the Lakers are title contenders, but they're certainly a team to watch at the trade deadline. If they make that, one deal that makes them a little bit better, it's really hard to, in a playoff series when a team has LeBron and Anthony Davis, Russell Westbrook, the Rui Hachimura looks like a nice deal right now. The Phoenix Suns have been looking for a deal from the beginning of the year to somehow find some depth at the forward spot. I know they've inquired about Kyle Kuzma in Washington. Kuzma has a player option. He can become a free agent after the season, and there's thoughts that if the Wizards can't retain him, that maybe they can make a deal for him. The Toronto Raptors are another team to watch. Not necessarily title contender, but they have players other teams want. Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, Fred VanVleet, and they have some contract issues on that team that they need to pay attention to moving forward. Are they going to be a taxpayer team? Do they want to spend all that money on that core four group, including Scotty Barnes? And so there are a couple things right there. I know the Pistons, I'm talking more about teams that have guys available. Bojan Bogdanovic for the Pistons. There's a lot of teams that would love his three-point shooting. And so those are a couple of the names that are out there and teams that might be willing to make deals.
Jeff, I know you got to go. I appreciate the time. Thank you so much. We could talk for another 20 minutes. I'm sure there's a lot to think about right now in terms of NBA storylines. Thanks for being with me.
No, thanks for having me on today.